Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. I've been busier than usual this month with travel and personal matters, and I'm also working on the fifth and final part of the video series that I started a couple of years ago now. So I haven't had time to research and record a second lecture this month like I would ordinarily want to do. So instead, as I've done a couple of times before, I'm going to share readings of a few poems. And I picked out 3 poems that are among my all-time favorites and that are seasonally appropriate, as you might find, and also hopefully thematically appropriate, since I have started talking some about colonial New England, and soon I'll be addressing specifically the so-called Great Awakening, the mass religious revival that swept through colonial America starting in New England in the mid-1700s. So the poems that I want to read, 2 of them are by Robert Lowell and 1 by Anne Sexton. So Robert Lowell was an eminent poet, one of the great American poets of the 20th century, and was seen as an intellectual and a sort of representative of the Yankee Protestant tradition. And he himself came from old New England Puritan stock. And as I think you'll find, he had a lot of sort of unresolved personal conflicts and ambivalence about that background that he came from. And it happens that he wrote 4 poems over the course of his career about Jonathan Edwards, who was a Congregationalist minister, theologian, and preacher in Western Massachusetts in the early 1700s. He actually was born and raised in Connecticut, in sort of the lower Connecticut Valley, and then, like many Puritan Yankee colonists, he moved up the Connecticut Valley, and he had a career as the minister of the town of Northampton in western Massachusetts, where he was highly respected. He had an intellectual life as a theologian and a philosopher. He had a strict empiricist philosophy that he put forward, which happened to be very similar to what George Berkeley in Ireland was theorizing at the same time. But meanwhile, he also was a barn-burning preacher and was known for fire-and-brimstone sermons, and he was a major inspiration for a religious revival in the Connecticut Valley in the 1730s, which many see then as sparking the wider Great Awakening across North America. However, he became very controversial, and the sort of old grandees of the Connecticut Valley removed him from his pulpit. He then migrated farther west and took up ministry at a small mission church in Stockbridge at the western edge of Massachusetts, and then finally was persuaded to take up the presidency of the College of New Jersey, the Protestant seminary that is now known as Princeton. And that's where he died shortly after taking office, when his smallpox inoculation went wrong. So he's a really remarkable and complicated colonial figure, and you'll see that Robert Lowell had a bit of an obsession with him, and at one point, I believe, actually claimed to be a descendant of Jonathan Edwards, although it turned out, genealogists looked into it and found out that was not true. So maybe he meant it in a sort of figurative or spiritual sense. But what I want to read is first Lowell's first poem that he published about Edwards, which is called Mr. Edwards and the Spider. And there are lines in this poem taken from Edwards' sermons, especially his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he compares the human soul to a spider being dangled by a thread over the fires of hell. Also, it contains lines and allusions to Edwards' book about the behavior of insects, which he wrote when he was, I believe, 13 years old and was just observing critters around Windsor, Connecticut, around the country homestead where he grew up in Connecticut. So there's a weird, you could say, connection and juxtaposition here between his sort of natural philosophy and his theology. So this poem was published in Lowell's first book, which was called Lord Weary's Castle, published when he was only about 30 in 1945, and it made him immediately famous. He won the Pulitzer Prize with his first book. And yet what is amazing about Lowell is that he continued to evolve and to experiment in new styles. So you can see this poem, I think, as a sort of early landmark of his highly formal style, which is highly philosophically and historically conscious. So we'll start with that poem. Mr. Edwards and the Spider. I saw the spiders marching through the air, swimming from tree to tree that mildewed day in latter August when the hay came creaking to the barn. But where the wind is westerly, where gnarled November makes the spiders fly into the apparitions of the sky, they purpose nothing but their ease and die, urgently beating east to sunrise and the sea. What are we in the hands of the great God? It was in vain you set up thorn and briar in battle array against the fire and treason crackling in your blood. For the wild thorns grow tame and will do nothing to oppose the flame. Your lacerations tell the losing game you play against a sickness past your cure. How will the hands be strong? How will the heart endure? A very little thing, a little worm or hourglass-blazoned spider, it is said, can kill a tiger. Will the dead hold up his mirror and affirm to the four winds the smell and flash of his authority? It's well if God, who holds you to the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider, will destroy, baffle, and dissipate your soul. As a small boy on Windsor Marsh, I saw the spider die when thrown into the bowels of fierce fire. There's no long struggle, no desire to get up on its feet and fly. It stretches out its feet and dies. This is the sinner's last retreat. Yes, and no strength exerted on the heat then sinews the abolished will, when sick and full of burning it will whistle on a brick. But who can plumb the sinking of that soul? Josiah Hawley, picture yourself cast into a brick kiln where the blast fans your quick vitals to a coal. If measured by a glass, how long would it seem burning? Let there pass a minute, 10 trillion, but the blaze is infinite, eternal. This is death, to die and know it. This is the Black Widow, death. So the second poem I want to read is by Anne Sexton, who is another 20th century poet from Boston, Massachusetts, like Robert Lowell, and who actually studied at one point in a seminar with Lowell while she was working on her first book. And Sexton was from a slightly different background, a bit more middle class, and she also was a wife and a mother, and she struggled with mental health and mental illness. And her first book, To Bedlam and Partway Back, she wrote after going through residential treatment. So this poem comes from that first book. And this one, as you'll see, it has an epigraph taken from Henry David Thoreau's famous book, Walden, the sort of first classic of Transcendentalism, and an early paean to the idea of finding yourself by going out alone into nature. And Thoreau and the Transcendentalists have often been seen as the antidote to old-style Calvinist Puritanism and its frosty moralism and even abhorrence of nature. So in this poem, I think you can see Anne Sexton she literally addresses Thoreau and tries to enter into a dialogue and to question this idea that his philosophy and his venture out, his errand into nature, is the antidote to Puritan self-doubt and guilt. So this is called Kind Sir, These Woods, and it was published in Sexton's book, To Bedlam and Partway Back, in 1960. Kind Sir, These Woods. This poem has an epigraph. For a man needs only to be turned around once with his eyes shut in the world to be lost. Not till we are lost do we begin to find ourselves. And that's from Walden by Thoreau. Kind sir, this is an old game that we played when we were 8 and 10. Sometimes on the island in Down Main in late August, when the cold fog blew in off the ocean, the forest between Dingley Dell and grandfather's cottage grew white and strange. It was as if every pine tree were a brown pole we did not know, as if day had rearranged into night and bats flew in sun. It was a trick to turn around once and know you were lost, knowing the crow's horn was crying in the dark, knowing that supper would never come, that the coast's cry of doom from that far-away bell buoy's bell said, "Your nursemaid is gone. Oh, mademoiselle!" The rowboat rocked over. Then you were dead. Turned around once, eyes tight, the thought in your head. Kind sir, lost and of your same kind, I have turned around twice with my eyes sealed, and the woods were white, and my night mind saw such strange happenings, untold and unreal. And opening my eyes, I am afraid, of course, to look, this inward look that society scorns. Still, I search in these woods and find nothing worse than myself, caught between the grapes and the thorns. So the third and final poem that I want to read is simply called Jonathan Edwards in Western Massachusetts. This was published in Robert Lowell's book For the Union Dead in 1964. So this is almost 20 years after Lord Weary's Castle and that earlier poem, Mr. Edwards and the Spider. And I think you'll see here he goes back to a lot of the same themes and images and revives this obsession with Edwards, but now with a different perspective and, as maybe you'll see, a different style. Jonathan Edwards in Western Massachusetts. Edward's great millstone and rock of hope has crumbled, but the square white houses of his flock stand in the open air, out in the cold, like sheep outside the fold. Hope lives in doubt. Faith is trying to do without faith. In Western Massachusetts, I could almost feel the frontier crack and disappear. Edwards thought the world would end there. We know how the world will end, but where is paradise? Each day farther from the pilgrim's blues for England and the promised land. Was it some country house that seemed as if it were Whitehall, if the Lord were there? So nobly did he live. Gardens designed that the breath of flowers in the wind, or crushed underfoot, came and went like warbling music. Bacon's great oak grove he refused to sell when he fell, saying, "Why should I sell my feathers?" Ah, paradise! Edwards, I would be afraid to meet you there as a shade. We move in different circles. As a boy, you built a booth in a swamp for prayer. Lying on your back, you saw the spiders fly, basking at their ease, swimming from tree to tree. So high they seemed tacked to the sky. You knew they would die. Poor country Berkeley at Yale, you saw the world was soul, the soul of God, the soul of Sarah Pierpont. So filled with delight in the great being, she hardly cared for anything. Walking the fields, sweetly singing, conversing with someone invisible. Then God's love shone in sun, moon, and stars, on earth, in the waters, in the air, in the loose winds, which used to greatly fix your mind. Often she saw you come home from a ride or a walk, your coat dotted with thoughts you had pinned there on slips of paper. You gave her Pompey, a Negro slave, and 11 children. Yet people were spiders in your moment of glory at the great awakening. Alas, how many in this very meeting-house are more than likely to remember my discourse in hell? The meeting-house remembered. You stood on stilts in the air, but you fell from your parish, all rising as by a winding stair. On my pilgrimage to Northampton, I found no relic except the round slice of an oak you are said to have planted. It was flesh-colored, new, and a common piece of kindling, only fit for burning. You, too, must have been green once, white wig and black coat, all cut from one cloth and designed like your mind. I love you faded, old, exiled and afraid to leave your last flock, a dozen Housatonic Indian children, afraid to leave all your writing, denying the freedom of the will. You were afraid to be president of Princeton and wrote, "My defects are well known. I have a constitution peculiarly unhappy, flaccid solids, vapid, sizzy, scarce fluids, causing a childish weakness, a low tide of spirits. I am contemptible, stiff and dull. Why should I leave behind my delight and entertainment, those studies that have swallowed up my mind?